The notification sound from Sarah's phone pierced the stillness of the Maine evening like a cry for help that would never be answered. Margaret Chen sat in her living room in Portland, Oregon, staring at the screen that had just delivered the most devastating news a mother could receive. Her daughter hadn't posted anything on social media for 3 days. For most parents, this might seem like a relief, a break from the constant digital chatter that defined their children's generation. But Margaret knew Sarah like she knew her own heartbeat, and Sarah never ever went silent online. Not for 3 days, not without warning, not when she was supposed to be living her dream trip along the rugged coastline of Maine. The last post had been a sunset photo from Owl's Head Island, a remote piece of land accessible only by private boat or the weekly ferry that served the handful of year-round residents and the occasional adventurous traveler. Sarah had captioned it simply, "Finally found my peace, 3 weeks in paradise starts now." Margaret's fingers trembled as she scrolled through her daughter's Instagram account, studying each image like a detective examining evidence. There was Sarah at Portland Head Light, her auburn hair whipping in the Atlantic wind, that infectious smile that had charmed everyone since she was 3 years old. Another photo showed her boarding the ferry to Owl's Head, backpack slung over her shoulder, eyes bright with the anticipation that always preceded her solo adventures. Sarah had always been a wanderer. Even as a child, she'd disappear into the neighborhood for hours, returning with pockets full of interesting rocks and stories about the people she'd met. Margaret used to worry then, but Sarah always came home. She always checked in. She always shared every detail of her experiences with an enthusiasm that made even the most mundane encounters sound like epic adventures. At 28, Sarah worked as a travel blogger, turning her wanderlust into a career that kept her constantly moving between cities, countries, and experiences. Her followers, nearly 50,000 of them, lived vicariously through her posts, watching her navigate cobblestone streets in Prague, sample street food in Bangkok, and find hidden waterfalls in Costa Rica. She was their window into a world of possibility, and they depended on her daily updates almost as much as Margaret did, which made the silence all the more terrifying. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed Sarah's number for the 15th time that day. It went straight to voicemail, just like every other attempt. "Hi, this is Sarah. I'm probably off exploring somewhere with terrible reception, but leave me a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I find civilization again." The cheerful voice that had once brought comfort now felt like a cruel joke. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to remember the last real conversation they'd had. It was 3 days before Sarah left for Maine. A video call where Sarah had shown off her new hiking boots and talked excitedly about the Airbnb she'd booked on Owl's Head Island. "Mom, you should see this place," Sarah had said, holding her laptop up to show Margaret the listing. "It's this gorgeous cottage right on the cliffs, and the owner says on clear days you can see all the way to Nova Scotia. Plus, look at these reviews. Everyone talks about how peaceful and transformative their stay was." Margaret had smiled and nodded, pushing down the familiar knot of anxiety that always formed when Sarah announced another solo trip. She'd learned years ago that expressing her fears only made Sarah more determined to prove her independence. Instead, she'd simply said, "That sounds wonderful, honey. Just promise me you'll check in regularly." "Of course, Mom, you know I always do." But she hadn't. And now Margaret sat in her too-quiet house, surrounded by framed photos of Sarah's adventures, wondering if her daughter was hurt, lost, or worse. The rational part of her mind offered explanations: poor cell reception, a broken phone, an impulsive decision to extend her digital detox. But the mother's intuition that had never steered her wrong was screaming that something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. Margaret had tried calling the Airbnb host that morning. The number went to a generic voicemail box that didn't identify the property or provide any useful information. She'd attempted to reach Airbnb customer service, but their policy prevented them from sharing guest information, even with family members. They suggested filing a missing person report with local authorities if she was genuinely concerned. The problem was, Margaret didn't even know which local authorities to contact. Owl's Head Island was so small, it didn't have its own police force. The Knox County Sheriff's Department handled law enforcement for the area, but when Margaret had called their non-emergency line, the Dispatcher had seemed skeptical about her concerns. "Ma'am, it's only been 3 days," the woman had said, in a tone that suggested she dealt with overprotective parents regularly. "Your daughter is an adult, and sometimes people just want to disconnect for a while. Has she ever done anything like this before?" "No," Margaret had insisted. "Never. She posts something every single day, sometimes multiple times. Her followers are starting to notice. This isn't like her. Well, if you don't hear from her by tomorrow, give us a call back and we can file a report." But honestly, most of these cases resolved themselves within a week. Most of these cases, the phrase had stuck with Margaret like a splinter. How many worried parents called that office? How many children went missing in the vast wilderness of coastal Maine? And how many of those cases actually did resolve themselves? Margaret opened her laptop and began researching Owl's Head Island. What she found did little to ease her worry. The island was home to fewer than 100 year-round residents, mostly fishermen and artists who valued the isolation. Tourism was limited by the difficult access and lack of amenities. No restaurants, no shops, no cell towers. The island's only connection to the mainland was the ferry that ran 3 times a week during the summer months, and once a week the rest of the year. If something had happened to Sarah on Owl's Head Island, it could be days before anyone discovered it. The island's remote location, which had attracted Sarah with its promise of peace and solitude, now seemed like the perfect place for someone to disappear without a trace. Margaret found herself studying satellite images of the island, trying to identify the cottage where Sarah was staying. The listing had shown a charming cedar-shingled house perched on dramatic cliffs, but from above all the houses looked similar, small structures scattered along the coastline like toys forgotten by a giant child. As evening deepened into night, Margaret's worry crystallized into determination. She couldn't sit in Oregon doing nothing while her daughter might be in danger on the other side of the continent. She opened her laptop and began searching for flights to Maine. If the authorities wouldn't take her concerns seriously, she'd have to investigate herself. The earliest flight she could find departed Portland at 6 a.m., with connections through Chicago and Boston that would get her to Portland, Maine by late afternoon. It would cost nearly $2,000, money she couldn't really afford on her teacher's salary. But Margaret didn't hesitate. She booked the flight, then began throwing clothes into a suitcase with shaking hands. As she packed, Margaret's mind raced through increasingly dark scenarios. Sarah alone in a cottage, injured and unable to call for help. Sarah lost in the Maine wilderness trying to find her way back to civilization. Sarah taken by someone who knew the island's isolation, made it the perfect place to commit a crime and disappear. She tried to push these thoughts away, focusing instead on practical concerns. She'd need to rent a car in Portland and figure out how to get to the ferry dock. She'd need to find a place to stay. Though she suspected the island itself had limited accommodations for unexpected visitors. Most importantly, she'd need to convince someone, the sheriff's department, the Coast Guard, anyone, to take her concerns seriously. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message, and her heart leaped with desperate hope. But it was just her sister Linda checking in about their mother's upcoming birthday plans. Margaret stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Sarah's missing. Flying to Maine tomorrow, will explain later." The response came immediately. "What, Margaret? Call me right now." But Margaret couldn't talk to Linda yet. She couldn't voice her fears aloud, because that would make them real, and she wasn't ready for that level of reality. Instead, she turned off her phone and continued packing, moving with the mechanical precision of someone trying not to think about what they're really doing. At midnight, Margaret sat on her bed, surrounded by the contents of her suitcase, wondering what a mother should pack when searching for her missing daughter. Practical clothes for the Maine coast, where October temperatures could range from crisp to freezing. Her phone charger, though she doubted there would be reliable service on the island. Cash, in case credit cards weren't accepted in such a remote location. And photographs of Sarah, recent ones that showed her face clearly. The photos were the hardest part. Looking through them, Margaret was struck by how young and vulnerable her daughter looked, despite being a competent adult who'd traveled the world alone. In Margaret's eyes, Sarah would always be the little girl who'd come running to her mother's bed during thunderstorms, seeking comfort and protection. And now Sarah was somewhere Margaret couldn't reach her, facing a storm Margaret couldn't shield her from. Margaret closed the suitcase and set her alarm for 4 a.m. As she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she tried to convince herself that she was overreacting. Sarah would probably call tomorrow, laughing about her phone dying or getting caught up in the island's digital detox atmosphere. They'd have a good laugh about Margaret's dramatic cross-country rescue mission, and it would become another story in the family's collection of Margaret's maternal overprotectiveness. But as the hours crawled by and sleep remained elusive, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was already too late. Somewhere on a remote island 3,000 miles away, her daughter needed help that might never come. And Margaret, who had spent Sarah's entire life trying to keep her safe, was about to discover that love and determination weren't always enough to bring someone home. The last thing Margaret saw before finally drifting off was Sarah's Instagram photo from Owl's Head Island. That beautiful sunset that now looked more like an ending than a beginning. Tomorrow, she would start searching for answers. Tonight, she would hold on to hope like a lifeline, even as it felt increasingly fragile in her desperate hands. At 3:47 a.m., Margaret's phone buzzed with a notification. Through the haze of fitful sleep, she grabbed for it with desperate urgency, praying it was Sarah. Instead, it was an Instagram alert. Sarah's account had gained 50 new followers overnight, people drawn by the mysterious absence of new posts from the usually active traveler. In the comments of her last photo, concerned followers were beginning to ask questions. "Sarah, are you okay? It's not like you to go silent. Missing your daily adventures. Hope everything's all right. Girl, your mum is probably freaking out right now. Post something so we know you're safe." Margaret stared at these messages from strangers who understood somehow that Sarah's silence was significant. If her own daughter's followers could sense something was wrong, why couldn't the authorities take her concerns seriously? In 6 hours, Margaret would be on a plane to Maine, beginning a journey that would change everything she thought she knew about her daughter, about trust, and about the dark secrets that could hide behind the most beautiful facades. But for now, in the pre-dawn darkness of her Oregon home, she could only lie awake and wonder if she would ever see her daughter again. The alarm hadn't even gone off when Margaret finally gave up on sleep and began getting ready to leave. As she moved through her morning routine in the dark, each action felt weighted with significance, perhaps the last normal morning she would ever have, before her world split into before and after Sarah vanished. She didn't know it yet, but 3,000 miles away, on a windswept island where the lighthouse beam cut through the fog like a searchlight, her daughter's story had already reached its devastating conclusion. The cottage where Sarah had sought peace and solitude now held secrets that would haunt everyone who discovered them. And somewhere in the silence between Sarah's last laugh and Margaret's first scream of anguish, the truth waited like a storm on the horizon, visible to those who knew how to look, but approaching with an inevitability that would leave nothing unchanged in its wake. The ferry to Owl's Head Island cut through the grey Atlantic waters like a knife through pewter, its diesel engine the only sound louder than Margaret's hammering heart. She stood at the bow despite the October chill, her hands gripping the salt-stained railing as the island emerged from the morning mist like something from a half-remembered dream. It had taken Margaret 36 hours to reach this point, a blur of airports, rental cars, and increasingly frantic phone calls to anyone who might have information about her daughter. The Knox County Sheriff's Department had finally agreed to meet her at the ferry dock in Rockland, though Deputy Williams had made it clear over the phone that he considered this a routine welfare check rather than an emergency. "Mrs. Chen," he'd said in a tone that suggested he'd had this conversation many times before, "I understand your concern, but we deal with these situations regularly. Young people go to remote places specifically to disconnect. The fact that she's not posting on social media isn't necessarily cause for alarm." But Margaret knew her daughter. Sarah might disconnect from the internet, but she would never disconnect from family. Not for 4 days, not without warning. Not when she'd promised to check in regularly. The island materialized around them as they approached the harbor, rocky shores crowned with wind-bent pines, a scatter of weathered houses, and a small fishing fleet bobbing at anchor. It was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly isolated, the kind of place that promised either profound peace or complete vulnerability, depending on your circumstances. Margaret spotted Deputy Williams immediately as the ferry docked. He was a compact man in his 50s, with graying hair and the patient expression of someone accustomed to dealing with tourist emergencies and worried relatives. He approached as Margaret disembarked, her overnight bag clutched tightly in her hands. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Deputy Williams. I understand you're concerned about your daughter." "Sarah Chen," Margaret said, extending her hand. "She's been staying in an Airbnb somewhere on the island. I haven't heard from her in 4 days, which is completely unlike her." Deputy Williams nodded and gestured toward a patrol SUV parked near the dock. "Let's start by locating the property where she's staying. Do you have the address?" Margaret pulled out her phone and showed him the booking confirmation she'd finally managed to access through Sarah's email account, a violation of privacy that would have mortified her under normal circumstances, but which now felt like a necessary survival tactic. "Cliff House Cottage," Deputy Williams read aloud. "I know the place. It's about 10 minutes drive from here up on the North Shore. Beautiful location, but pretty isolated. The nearest neighbor is probably half a mile away." As they drove through the island's small village center, Margaret was struck by how quiet everything seemed. A few locals moved between the general store and post office, but there was none of the bustling activity she'd expected from a tourist destination. It felt more like a place where people came to disappear rather than to be found. "How well do you know the owner of this property?" Margaret asked as they wound up a narrow road lined with dense pine forest. "Gerald Morrison? He's been on the island about 15 years now. Retired from some kind of business in Boston, bought the cottage as a getaway, started renting it out a few years back. Quiet guy, keeps to himself mostly. Never had any complaints about him or the property." Something in the deputy's tone made Margaret look at him more closely. But Deputy Williams was quiet for a moment, navigating a particularly sharp curve, before responding. "Well, there have been a couple incidents over the years. It's nothing serious, but sometimes guests report feeling uneasy there. Usually women traveling alone. They check out early, say they didn't feel safe, but they can never really explain why." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. What kind of incidents? Nothing concrete. Feelings of being watched, strange noises at night, that sort of thing. Could be anything. Old house settling, wild animals, overactive imaginations. Isolated places can play tricks on people's minds, especially city folks who aren't used to the silence. They crested a hill, and suddenly the ocean spread out before them, vast and grey under the overcast sky. The cottage came into view, a charming cedar-shingled house perched on a dramatic bluff, exactly as it had appeared in Sarah's booking photos. It looked like something from a postcard, the kind of place where stressed urbanites came to find themselves. But as they pulled into the gravel driveway, Margaret noticed details that hadn't been visible in the online listing. The windows were small and high, giving the place a fortress-like quality despite its picturesque appearance. The nearest house was indeed far away, barely visible through the trees. And the cliff behind the cottage dropped sharply to jagged rocks, where waves crashed with hypnotic fury. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. And it was absolutely the last place Margaret would want her daughter to stay alone. Deputy Williams parked, and they approached the front door together. The cottage looked undisturbed from the outside. No signs of forced entry, no obvious damage, no indication that anything was amiss. But Margaret noticed that the curtains were drawn tight across all the windows, creating an atmosphere of deliberate concealment. "Mrs. Chen," Deputy Williams was holding his phone. "I'm trying to reach Gerald Morrison to let him know we need to check on his guest, but he's not answering. Standard procedure would be to wait for permission from the property owner, but given your concerns about your daughter's welfare..." "Please," Margaret interrupted, "I just need to know she's okay." The deputy nodded and approached the front door. He knocked firmly and called out, "Knox County Sheriff's Department, we're conducting a welfare check." When no response came, he tried the door handle. It was locked. Deputy Williams walked around the cottage, checking windows and looking for any signs of occupancy. Margaret followed, her anxiety building with each step. Everything looked normal from the outside, but the silence felt oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. "Her rental car should be here," Margaret said suddenly. "Sarah would have needed transportation to get groceries, explore the island." They found the car parked behind the cottage, a red Jeep that matched the vehicle Sarah had posted photos of during her drive up the Maine coast. Deputy Williams approached it carefully, peering through the windows. "Luggage is still in the back," he reported. "Looks like groceries too, bottles of water, some canned goods, like she was planning to stay for a while." Margaret felt her knees go weak. If Sarah had left the island voluntarily, she would have taken her car. If she decided to cut her trip short, she would have loaded her luggage and driven back to Portland. The presence of her belongings suggested she'd never intended to leave, or had been prevented from doing so. "We need to get inside," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Deputy Williams was already reaching for his radio. "I'm going to call for backup and a locksmith. Mrs. Chen, I need you to understand that whatever we find in there, it might not be what you're hoping for." Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure what she was hoping for anymore. The best case scenario, that Sarah was inside, safe but unable to communicate, seemed increasingly unlikely. The worst-case scenarios were too terrible to contemplate. While they waited for backup, Deputy Williams questioned Margaret about Sarah's habits, her state of mind, her reasons for choosing this particular destination. Margaret found herself describing her daughter to a stranger, trying to capture the essence of someone who had suddenly become three-dimensional in a way she'd never had to consider before. "Sarah's always been independent," Margaret explained. "Even as a child, she was drawn to solitary activities, but she's also responsible. She calls when she says she will, she follows through on commitments. This silence isn't rebellion or a need for space, it's completely out of character." Another sheriff's vehicle arrived, followed by a local locksmith who looked as weathered as the cottage itself. Margaret noticed how the men spoke in low voices, their expressions serious, as Deputy Williams briefed them on the situation. This was no longer a routine welfare check. It was beginning to feel like a crime scene investigation. The locksmith worked quickly and efficiently, and within minutes the front door swung open. Deputy Williams entered first, his hand resting on his service weapon as a precaution. Margaret followed close behind, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The cottage's interior was exactly as it had appeared in Sarah's booking photos, rustic but comfortable, with exposed beams, a stone fireplace and large windows that would normally offer stunning ocean views. But the drawn curtains created an atmosphere of artificial twilight, and there was something unsettling about the stillness of the air. "Sarah?" Margaret called out, though she knew there would be no answer. They moved through the main room into a small kitchen where Deputy Williams stopped abruptly. On the counter sat a plate with half-eaten food, what looked like pasta, salad, and bread, as if someone had been interrupted mid-meal. Next to it was an open bottle of wine, still containing about half its contents. "This is probably from several days ago," the deputy observed, noting the dried edges of the food. "But it looks like she was eating normally, no signs of distress." They continued into the cottage's single bedroom, where Margaret gasped at what they found. Sarah's suitcase was open on the bed, clothes neatly folded inside, as if she'd been living out of it rather than unpacking completely. Her toiletries were arranged on the dresser, including prescription medications that Margaret knew Sarah took daily. "She wouldn't leave without these," Margaret said, picking up the medication bottles. "Sarah has anxiety issues, mild ones, but she's religious about taking her medication. She would never travel without it." Deputy Williams made notes while the other officer photographed everything. Margaret studied the room, looking for any clue about what might have happened to her daughter. Sarah's journal, a leather-bound book she carried everywhere, was conspicuously absent, though her laptop sat closed on the small writing desk by the window. It was in the bathroom that they found the detail that would haunt Margaret for months to come. "Mrs. Chen," Deputy Williams called from the doorway, his voice strangely tight. "I need you to see this, but I want you to prepare yourself." Margaret approached slowly, not sure what could be worse than the evidence of Sarah's interrupted life they'd already discovered. The bathroom was small but charming, with vintage fixtures and a clawfoot tub. That would have delighted any travel blogger looking for authentic New England character, but it was the mirror above the sink that made Margaret's blood freeze. Written across the glass, as if traced by a finger in steam, were the words, "She never left." The letters were clearly visible despite the fact that there was no steam in the bathroom. No evidence of recent shower activity. No logical explanation for how the words had appeared or remained visible on the glass surface. "How is this possible?" Margaret whispered, staring at the message that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. Deputy Williams was studying the mirror with professional interest, though Margaret could see the unease in his expression. "I've never seen anything quite like this. The writing appears to be made with condensation, but there's no moisture source active in this bathroom. The shower is dry, the faucets aren't running." "What does it mean?" Margaret asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "I honestly don't know, Mrs. Chen, but we're going to find out." As crime scene technicians arrived and began processing the cottage, Margaret found herself drawn back to the bathroom mirror again and again. The message seemed to mock her hope that Sarah had simply left the island of her own accord. According to someone or something, Sarah had never left at all. But if Sarah was still on the island, where was she, and who had written those words on the mirror? The investigation was just beginning, but Margaret already sensed that whatever had happened to her daughter was far more complex and disturbing than a simple disappearance. The cottage that had promised Sarah peace and solitude had become the center of a mystery that would challenge everything Margaret thought she knew about safety, trust, and the dark secrets that could hide behind the most beautiful facades. As afternoon faded into evening, Margaret found herself standing on the cottage's back deck, staring out at the endless ocean while investigators worked inside. Somewhere out there, or perhaps somewhere much closer, her daughter's story was waiting to be discovered. Margaret just prayed that when they found the truth, it would be something she could survive knowing. The mirror haunted Margaret's dreams that night, its cryptic message echoing through her subconscious like a prayer gone wrong. She'd taken a room at the island's only bed and breakfast, a cramped but clean establishment, run by Eleanor Hartwell, a woman in her 70s who seemed to know everyone and everything that happened on Owl's Head Island. "That Morrison cottage has always given me the shivers," Eleanor had said as she showed Margaret to her room. "Beautiful location, but there's something not right about that place. I've told Gerald as much, but he just laughs it off." Now, sitting in the bed and breakfast's small dining room at dawn, Margaret found herself pumping Eleanor for information while nursing her third cup of coffee. Sleep had been impossible, and the elderly innkeeper seemed more than willing to share what she knew about the cottage where Sarah had been staying. "The strange thing is," Eleanor continued, settling into the chair across from Margaret with her own steaming mug, "Gerald's always been so particular about his guests. Usually only books to couples or families, hardly ever single women. Said it was too isolated for solo travelers, but this summer, that all changed." Margaret looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Well, your Sarah wasn't the first young woman to stay there alone this year. There was another girl back in July. Pretty little thing from New York about your daughter's age. She checked out after just 2 nights, looked shaken up about something. Wouldn't say what happened, just packed up her car and caught the next ferry off the island." "Did you talk to her?" Eleanor nodded, her expression grave. "She stopped here for coffee before leaving. Said she'd felt like someone was watching her at the cottage, hearing footsteps on the roof at night, finding things moved around when she knew she'd left them elsewhere. Gerald claimed it was just island wildlife and old house noises, but that girl was genuinely frightened." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "Were there others?" "At least 2 more that I know of, a photographer from Boston in early August, and a writer from Portland who came up in September. Both young women traveling alone, both cut their stays short. The photographer actually came to me asking if there were any local stories about the cottage, like she thought it might be haunted or something." "What did you tell her?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "I told her what I knew about the history of the place. It wasn't always a vacation rental, you know. Back in the 70s and 80s, it was owned by a man named Thomas Blackwood. He was, well, let's just say he had a reputation with young women. Nothing was ever proven, but there were whispers." "What kind of whispers?" "Women who visited him there sometimes left the island suddenly, in the middle of the night. Some claimed they couldn't remember parts of their visits, like they'd lost time somehow. Others talked about feeling drugged, disoriented. But Blackwood was well connected on the mainland, had money and influence. Nothing ever came of the allegations." Margaret's hands began to shake. What happened to him? Died in a boating accident in 1989. The cottage sat empty for years after that, until Gerald bought it and fixed it up. I thought the renovations might have cleared the air, so to speak, but lately... Eleanor trailed off, studying Margaret's face carefully. Lately what? Lately, I've been wondering if some places just hold on to darkness no matter how much you try to brighten them up. Margaret spent the morning walking the island's perimeter road, trying to process what Eleanor had told her while waiting for Deputy Williams to return her calls. The more she learned about the cottage where Sarah had been staying, the more convinced she became that her daughter's disappearance was not random or accidental. When her phone finally rang, Margaret answered before the first ring finished. "Mrs. Chen, this is Deputy Williams. I have some updates about your daughter's case, but I'd prefer to discuss them in person. Can you meet me at the cottage in an hour?" Margaret's stomach clenched. "Did you find her?" "Not yet, but we've discovered some things that might help us understand what happened. I'll explain when I see you." The drive to Cliff House Cottage felt different in daylight. What had seemed picturesque the day before now appeared sinister. The isolated location that could hide any number of secrets, the dense woods that could conceal evidence for decades, the dramatic cliffs that could make a body disappear forever, into the churning Atlantic. Deputy Williams was waiting with a crime scene technician and a woman Margaret didn't recognize. She was introduced as Detective Sarah Morrison from the Maine State Police, a coincidence of names that felt like a cruel joke. "Mrs. Chen," Detective Morrison began, "we've processed the cottage thoroughly, and while we haven't found any signs of struggle or foul play, we have discovered several things that concern us." They stood in the cottage's main room while Detective Morrison consulted her notes. "First, we found your daughter's journal hidden under the mattress in the bedroom. It's clear she was documenting some disturbing experiences during her stay here." Margaret's heart leaped. "Can I see it?" "We'll provide you with copies of the relevant entries, but I want to prepare you. Some of the content is unsettling. Your daughter wrote about feeling watched, about finding her belongings moved when she was certain she'd left them elsewhere, about hearing sounds in the walls at night." "Just like the other women," Margaret whispered. Detective Morrison looked surprised. "What other women?" Margaret shared what Eleanor had told her about the previous guests who'd left early, about the cottage's dark history under Thomas Blackwood's ownership. She watched the detective's expression grow increasingly serious as she spoke. "We'll need to interview these previous guests," Detective Morrison said, making notes. "This pattern you're describing could be significant." The crime scene technician, a young man with careful hands and patient eyes, stepped forward. "There's something else, Mrs. Chen, about the mirror in the bathroom." Margaret followed him into the small bathroom, where the mysterious message was still clearly visible on the glass surface. "We've run every test we can think of," he explained. "The writing isn't made with any substance we can identify. Not soap, not cosmetics, not anything your daughter had with her. And here's the really strange part." He held up a before and after photograph. "We tried to clean the writing off yesterday using standard glass cleaners. It wouldn't budge. Then we tried industrial solvents, the kind that remove permanent markers. Nothing. The writing appears to be etched into the glass somehow, but our equipment shows no physical alteration to the surface." Margaret stared at the mirror, feeling as if she was looking into an alternate reality where the normal rules didn't apply. "How is that possible?" "Honestly, we don't know. We've never encountered anything like it." Detective Morrison rejoined them, her expression grim. "Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you some difficult questions about your daughter's state of mind before this trip. Was she dealing with any personal problems? Relationship issues, financial stress, anything that might have made her vulnerable to manipulation?" "What do you mean?" "What I'm about to tell you needs to stay confidential for now, but we've discovered that Gerald Morrison, the cottage's owner, has some concerning elements in his background. Nothing criminal, but a pattern of behavior that raises red flags." Margaret felt the walls of the small bathroom closing in around her. What kind of pattern? Multiple complaints from women who worked for his business in Boston. Claims of inappropriate behavior, unwanted attention, creating uncomfortable situations. None of the complaints resulted in formal charges, but the pattern is consistent, with someone who might target vulnerable women. "You think he did something to Sarah?" We don't know yet. Morrison claims he was off-island during your daughter's stay, visiting family in Bar Harbor. We're verifying his alibi, but even if he wasn't physically present, he could have given someone else access to the property. They moved back into the main room, where Deputy Williams was examining Sarah's laptop. We found something else that might be relevant, he said, looking up as they approached. Your daughter's browser history shows she was researching the cottage's history, specifically looking into Thomas Blackwood and his connection to the property. Margaret's breath caught. When? The searches were made on her second night here. It looks like she started having strange experiences and decided to investigate whether there was a history of similar incidents. Detective Morrison pulled up Sarah's journal entries on her tablet and handed it to Margaret. These are from her last 3 days on the island. I want you to read them, but please sit down first. Margaret settled into one of the cottage's rustic chairs and began reading her daughter's familiar handwriting. Day 1 finally made it to Owl's Head Island. The cottage is even more beautiful than the photos. Perfect spot for writing and reflection. Had a peaceful dinner watching the sunset from the deck. This is exactly what I needed. Day 2, woke up feeling like someone had been in the cottage during the night. I know I locked the front door, but this morning it was unlocked. Probably just forgot in my excitement yesterday. The isolation is taking some getting used to. Every sound seems amplified. Heard what sounded like footsteps on the roof around 2 a.m., but it was probably just branches or animals. Day 3. Something is definitely wrong here. Found my camera moved from the bedside table to the kitchen counter. I know I didn't put it there. Also discovered my toiletries rearranged in the bathroom. Toothbrush and face wash switched positions. Starting to feel like someone has access to this place. Called the owner but got voicemail. Maybe there's a caretaker I don't know about. Day 4. Can't shake the feeling of being watched. Did some research on the cottage's history and found disturbing information about the previous owner. Multiple women reported strange experiences here in the 1980s. Some kind of pattern of women being drugged or manipulated. I'm starting to wonder if someone is continuing that tradition. I've been careful about my food and drinks, but I've been having trouble sleeping and feeling disoriented during the day. Yesterday I couldn't remember taking a shower, but my hair was wet when I woke up from a nap. I'm getting scared. If something happens to me, check the basement. I found a door behind the water heater that the owner definitely didn't mention. It's locked, but I could hear sounds coming from behind it last night, like someone moving around down there. The journal entries ended abruptly. Margaret looked up at Detective Morrison with tears streaming down her face. There's a basement? We checked. There's a small cellar accessible from outside the cottage, mainly used for storage, but we didn't find any hidden door behind the water heater. If there was one, it's been sealed up or concealed somehow. Margaret felt as if she was drowning in questions without answers. Her daughter had been afraid, had suspected she was being stalked or drugged, had discovered something about the cottage that put her in danger. And then she had simply vanished, leaving behind only her belongings and that inexplicable message on the bathroom mirror. What happens now? Margaret asked. We're expanding the search, Detective Morrison replied. Coast Guard is checking the waters around the island. We're bringing in search dogs for the wooded areas, and we're interviewing everyone on the island who might have seen or heard something unusual. And we're also investigating Gerald Morrison more thoroughly and trying to track down the previous guests who had problems here. But do you think... Margaret couldn't finish the question. Detective Morrison's expression was gentle but honest. Mrs. Chen, based on your daughter's journal entries and the pattern of incidents at this location, we're treating this as a potential abduction case. We believe someone on this island knows what happened to Sarah, and we're going to find them. As Margaret left the cottage that afternoon, she turned back to look at the building that had been the last place her daughter was seen alive. In the late afternoon, light with storm clouds gathering on the horizon, it looked less like a peaceful retreat and more like a trap disguised as paradise. The investigation was expanding, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. Somewhere on this small island, or perhaps somewhere far away by now, her daughter's story was reaching its conclusion. Margaret just prayed that when they found the truth, there would still be hope for bringing Sarah home. The message on the bathroom mirror seemed to mock that hope. She never left. If Sarah truly never left the island, where was she? And who had written those words that defied explanation and resisted every attempt to erase them? As Margaret drove back toward the village, she didn't notice the figure watching from the trees behind the cottage, or the way the basement door that investigators had found sealed and unused swung silently open in the evening breeze, revealing darkness that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The breakthrough came on Margaret's fifth day on Owl's Head Island, delivered by the most unlikely source imaginable. Eleanor Hartwell appeared at Margaret's door just after dawn, still in her bathrobe but clutching a manila envelope with shaking hands. "I couldn't sleep last night," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with excitement and fear. "I kept thinking about your Sarah, about those other girls, about what you told me. So I went up to my attic and dug through some old boxes. I found something that changes everything." Margaret invited her in, and Eleanor spread the contents of the envelope across the small dining table with the reverence of someone handling ancient artifacts. There were newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, and several black and white photographs that looked like they'd been taken in the 1980s. "I was the island's unofficial historian back then," Eleanor explained. "I kept clippings of anything. That happened here, thinking someday I might write a book about the place. I'd forgotten about these until last night." Margaret studied the newspaper headlines with growing horror. "Police investigate disappearances on Owl's Head Island. Third woman vanishes during island visit. Blackwood estate under scrutiny." Thomas Blackwood didn't just have a reputation, Eleanor continued, her voice barely above a whisper. There were 3 women who vanished from his cottage between 1987 and 1989. 3 young women, all traveling alone, all there for what they thought would be peaceful retreats. Margaret picked up one of the photographs, a police scene outside the very cottage where Sarah had been staying. What happened to them? They were never found. The official theory was that they'd fallen from the cliffs during nighttime walks, bodies swept out to sea. But the families never believed it, especially after the first girl's sister hired a private investigator. Eleanor handed Margaret another clipping, this one from a Boston newspaper. The headline read, "Private Detective Claims Island Cover-Up in Missing Women Case." The investigator found evidence that Blackwood was drugging his female guests, Eleanor continued. He'd installed hidden cameras throughout the cottage, was recording their private moments. But before the investigation could go further, Blackwood died in that boating accident. Case closed, files sealed. Everyone wanted to forget it ever happened. Margaret felt sick to her stomach. But if Blackwood died in 1989, who's doing this now? Eleanor pulled out the final photograph, and Margaret's world tilted off its axis. It showed 2 men standing beside the cottage in what appeared to be the mid-1980s. One was clearly Thomas Blackwood, tall, dark-haired, with the kind of predatory smile that never reached his eyes. The other was younger, perhaps in his 20s, with lighter hair and an eager expression. "That's Blackwood's nephew," Eleanor said quietly. "Gerald Morrison." The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. Gerald Morrison, the current owner of the cottage, the man who had supposedly been off-island during Sarah's stay, the man whose background check had revealed concerning patterns with women. Gerald was Blackwood's protege, Eleanor continued. Spent summers on the island helping his uncle with property maintenance, learning the business. After Blackwood died, Gerald inherited everything. The cottage, the boat, and apparently his uncle's twisted interests. Margaret stared at the photograph, studying the young man who had grown up to become the cottage's current owner. The police said his alibi checked out. Did they verify it personally, or did they just make phone calls? Margaret's blood ran cold. She grabbed her phone and dialed Detective Morrison's number, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried Deputy Williams with the same result. It was early enough that neither officer would be in the office. But Margaret couldn't wait. "Eleanor, I need to borrow your car." "Where are you going?" "To find Gerald Morrison." The drive to Morrison's house took Margaret through parts of the island she hadn't seen before, narrow dirt roads that wound through dense forest, past abandoned fishing shacks and overgrown clearings that spoke of the island's shrinking population. Eleanor had given her directions to Morrison's property, a compound on the island's southeastern shore, that included both his residence and several outbuildings. Margaret's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She knew she should wait for the police, should let trained professionals handle the confrontation with Morrison. But 5 days of helplessness and growing dread had crystallized into a desperate need for action. If Morrison had taken Sarah, every minute of delay might be a minute too late. The Morrison property was larger than Margaret had expected. A modern house overlooking a private cove with a large garage, workshop, and what appeared to be a storage shed closer to the water. Morrison's truck was parked in the driveway, confirming he was home despite his supposed alibi. Margaret parked at the end of the long driveway and approached the house on foot, her phone in her hand ready to call for help if needed. The morning was eerily quiet, with only the sound of waves against the rocky shore and the distant cry of seagulls. She was 20 feet from the front door when she heard it, a sound that made her heart stop and her blood freeze in her veins. It was faint, muffled by distance and whatever barriers lay between, but unmistakable to a mother's ears. Sarah's voice calling for help. Margaret's rational mind told her to run, to call the police, to get back up before confronting whatever was happening in that house. But her mother's heart overruled every survival instinct. Her daughter was alive, was in that building, was calling for help. Nothing else mattered. She tried the front door and found it unlocked. The house's interior was spartanly furnished and meticulously clean, with an unsettling sterility that reminded Margaret of a medical facility rather than a home. She followed the sound of Sarah's voice through the main floor, past a kitchen that looked rarely used, and a living room that felt more like a waiting area than a place where someone actually lived. The voice was coming from below. Margaret found the basement door hidden behind a bookshelf in what appeared to be Morrison's office. It wasn't concealed particularly well, more like it was meant to be found eventually by someone who knew to look for it. The door was heavy steel, more substantial than anything that belonged in a residential basement, and it was secured with an electronic lock that blinked red in the dim light. But the lock wasn't engaged. The door stood slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry and forgotten to secure it properly. Margaret pulled the door open and found herself staring down a set of concrete stairs that disappeared into darkness. The sound of Sarah's voice was clearer now, along with other sounds that made Margaret's skin crawl. The hum of electronics, the whisper of ventilation systems, the metallic clink of restraints. She descended the stairs with her phone's flashlight, leading the way, each step taking her deeper into a nightmare she couldn't have imagined. The basement wasn't the rough stone cellar she'd expected, but a finished space with acoustic panels on the walls and professional lighting equipment mounted from the ceiling. At the bottom of the stairs, Margaret found herself in what could only be described as a filming studio. Multiple cameras on tripods were positioned around a central area that contained a bed, a chair, and restraint equipment that made Margaret's stomach turn. But it was the wall of monitors that truly revealed the scope of Morrison's operation. Each screen showed a different view of Cliff House Cottage, the bedroom, the bathroom, the kitchen, even angles that must have been hidden in the walls and ceiling. Margaret realized with horror that Morrison had been watching every guest who stayed at the cottage, recording their most private moments, studying their behaviors and vulnerabilities. But one monitor showed something different. It was a live feed from what appeared to be another room in this same basement, and there, restrained but clearly alive, was Sarah. Margaret's scream of relief and rage echoed through the basement like a battle cry. She ran toward the door that led to the room where her daughter was being held, not caring about stealth or strategy or any consideration, beyond reaching Sarah and getting her to safety. The door was locked, but Margaret pounded on it with her fists, shouting Sarah's name. From the other side came the muffled sound of her daughter's voice, crying with relief and terror. "Mom! Mom! Is that really you? I'm here, baby. I'm going to get you out." Margaret looked around frantically for something to break down the door, but before she could find anything, a voice behind her made her freeze. "I was wondering when you'd finally make it down here." Gerald Morrison stood at the bottom of the stairs, blocking her escape route. He was a slight man in his 50s, unremarkable in every way except for his eyes, which held the same predatory coldness Margaret had seen in the old photograph of his uncle. "Where is the key to this door?" Margaret demanded, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Morrison smiled, the expression never reaching those cold eyes. "You know, your daughter lasted longer than most. Usually they give up fighting after the first week, but Sarah kept trying to escape, kept believing someone would come for her. Very admirable, really. Let her go right now." "I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, Sarah has become part of something much larger than herself. She's helping me continue my uncle's work, documenting the psychological breakdown of the modern woman under controlled stress conditions. Fascinating research, really." Margaret realized with dawning horror that Morrison was completely insane, that he genuinely believed his twisted activities constituted legitimate research rather than torture and imprisonment. She also realized that reasoning with him was impossible. Her only chance was to keep him talking while she figured out how to reach Sarah. "The other women," Margaret said, "the ones who disappeared in the 1980s, what did you do with them?" Morrison's expression grew wistful. "Uncle Thomas taught me that some subjects are more valuable for long-term study than others. The ones who showed particular resilience, who maintained their fighting spirit despite the stress, they deserved special consideration." Margaret felt sick. "They're here in this basement?" "Oh no, not anymore. This facility is much more advanced than Uncle Thomas's original setup. I had to make some modifications after inheriting the property, bring everything up to modern standards. The old subjects were relocated to make room for the new equipment." The casual way he discussed human beings as subjects made Margaret want to scream, but she forced herself to stay focused. Behind the locked door, she could hear Sarah moving around, possibly trying to find something to break down the barrier from her side. "The message on the bathroom mirror," Margaret said, suddenly understanding. "You wrote that?" Morrison looked pleased. "Very good. That was a nice touch, don't you think? I wanted to leave a clue that would bring the right kind of investigator to the island. Someone with emotional investment in the case. Someone who would be properly motivated to dig deeper than the local police. You wanted me to come here?" "Of course. Sarah is an excellent subject, but her psychological profile suggested she would be most interesting under conditions of extreme stress related to family separation. Having her mother search for her, get close to the truth, face the same fate, that's the kind of scenario that produces truly compelling data." Margaret realized she had walked directly into Morrison's trap, that her desperate search for Sarah had been anticipated and manipulated from the beginning. But she also realized that Morrison's arrogance was his weakness. He was so proud of his elaborate scheme that he couldn't resist explaining it. "The cottage is wired with cameras," she said, buying time while edging closer to a workbench that held various tools. "Every room, every angle. I've been recording guests there for 15 years, building a comprehensive database of female psychology under isolation stress. Most subjects leave early, but the interesting ones, the ones who show real resilience, they get invited to participate in the extended study program." Margaret's hand closed around a heavy wrench on the workbench. Like Sarah, and now, like you. "This is actually quite exciting. I've never had the opportunity to study a mother-daughter dynamic under these conditions. The data should be extraordinary." Morrison reached into his pocket and pulled out what appeared to be a syringe. "Don't worry, Mrs. Chen. The initial sedation is quite gentle. You'll wake up in a comfortable room with your daughter, and then we can begin the real work." Margaret gripped the wrench tighter. "You made one mistake, Morrison." "What's that?" "You underestimated what a mother will do to save her child." Margaret swung the wrench with every ounce of strength she possessed, catching Morrison in the side of the head before he could react. He collapsed to the concrete floor, the syringe skittering away into the darkness. Margaret grabbed his keys and unlocked the door to Sarah's prison. Her daughter fell into her arms, both of them crying and holding each other with desperate relief. Sarah was thin and pale, clearly traumatized but alive and aware. "We have to get out of here," Margaret said, helping Sarah to her feet. But as they reached the bottom of the stairs, Morrison stirred and began to rise. Blood streamed down the side of his face, but his eyes still held that cold, predatory gleam. "You can't leave," he said, his voice thick with pain and rage. "You're part of the study now. The research must continue." Margaret pushed Sarah up the stairs ahead of her and followed, slamming the basement door behind them and dragging the bookshelf in front of it. Morrison's enraged shouts echoed from below as they ran through the house toward the front door. They were halfway to Eleanor's borrowed car when Margaret heard the basement door crash open behind them. Morrison emerged from the house, no longer the composed researcher, but a wild-eyed predator whose carefully controlled experiment had been destroyed. "Get in the car!" Margaret shouted to Sarah, who was moving slowly after days of captivity. Margaret started the engine as Morrison ran toward them, covering the distance with frightening speed. The car lurched forward, just as Morrison reached the driver's side door. He grabbed the handle and held on as Margaret accelerated, his face pressed against the window like a nightmare given form. For a terrifying moment, Margaret thought he might actually be strong enough to stop the car through sheer determination. Then his grip failed, and he tumbled away into the gravel driveway. Margaret didn't slow down until they reached the main road, and didn't stop until they reached the sheriff's office in the village. Deputy Williams and Detective Morrison were both waiting when they arrived, having finally received Margaret's frantic voicemails from earlier that morning. The sight of Sarah, alive but clearly traumatized, sent both officers into immediate action mode. "Gerald Morrison is at his house," Margaret said without preamble. "He's been holding my daughter prisoner in his basement for 5 days. He has cameras throughout the cottage. He's been drugging and recording female guests for years, and I think he killed the women who disappeared in the 1980s. The arrest of Gerald Morrison happened swiftly and efficiently. When police searched his basement, they found not only the elaborate recording and imprisonment facility Margaret had described, but also evidence of his long history of stalking and abusing women who stayed at Cliff House Cottage. The hidden cameras throughout the cottage had recorded hundreds of hours of footage spanning more than a decade, women sleeping, bathing, changing clothes, all unknowingly performing for Morrison's twisted voyeuristic research. More disturbing was the evidence suggesting that Morrison had been drugging selected guests, studying their reactions to various substances and psychological manipulations. But it was the discovery in Morrison's workshop that provided the most chilling evidence of his crimes. Hidden behind false walls, investigators found personal belongings from multiple women: jewelry, driver's licenses, items of clothing, including identification cards for the 3 women who had disappeared during the 1980s. Gerald Morrison would eventually be charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. His research had been nothing more than elaborate torture and exploitation, justified by a twisted intellectual framework that existed only in his deranged mind. Sarah's recovery was slow but steady. The physical effects of her captivity faded within weeks, but the psychological trauma took longer to heal. She struggled with anxiety and claustrophobia, found it difficult to travel alone, and had nightmares about the sound of electronic locks clicking shut. But she was alive. She was home. And eventually, with therapy and time and the unwavering support of her family, she began to reclaim her life from the darkness that had tried to swallow her. The cottage on Owl's Head Island was demolished 6 months after Sarah's rescue. The island's residents, led by Eleanor Hartwell, raised funds to purchase the property and ensure it could never again be used to harm innocent visitors. In its place, they built a small memorial garden overlooking the ocean, a place of peace and remembrance for all the women who had suffered there. The message that had appeared on the bathroom mirror, "She never left," remained an unexplained mystery. Crime scene technicians had photographed and documented it thoroughly, but could never determine how it had appeared or why it couldn't be erased. Some suggested it had been a psychological trick, a manifestation of collective guilt and fear. Others believed it was somehow connected to Morrison's electronic surveillance system. Margaret preferred a different explanation. She believed the message had been a warning, left by one of Morrison's previous victims, who had found a way to reach beyond her own tragedy to help save others. Whether that was possible, or simply the desperate hope of a mother who had come too close to losing everything, Margaret didn't care. Some mysteries were more beautiful left unsolved. A year after Sarah's rescue, Margaret published a book about their experience. Not for profit or fame, but to ensure that other families would recognize the warning signs they had missed, that other mothers would trust their instincts when their children went silent, that other young women would understand that even the Most beautiful destinations could hide unimaginable darkness. The book's dedication was simple: for Sarah, who never stopped fighting, for the women we couldn't save, and for every mother who refuses to give up hope. Because in the end, that was what had saved them. Not police procedures or criminal investigations or forensic science, but the simple, inexorable force of a mother's love and a daughter's resilience. Some bonds were stronger than locks and chains, more powerful than fear and isolation. Some bonds could survive anything. And there you have it, a story that reminds us all that the strongest force in this world isn't hatred or evil, but love and the refusal to give up on the people we care about. Margaret's journey to save Sarah shows us that sometimes the scariest monsters wear ordinary faces and hide behind beautiful facades. But that determination and love can overcome even the darkest circumstances. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people you love and the lengths you'd go to protect them, please take a moment to show your support. Hit that subscribe button if you want more stories that explore the depths of human resilience and the power of family bonds. Give this video a thumbs up if Margaret's courage inspired you, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts about this incredible journey of survival and love. Have you ever had to trust your instincts about someone's safety? Have you ever felt that mother's intuition that something was wrong, even when everyone else told you to relax? Share your experiences in the comments. Your story might help another family recognize danger before it's too late. Remember, the most important lesson from Margaret and Sarah's story isn't about the evil they encountered, but about the love that conquered it. In a world that can sometimes feel dark and dangerous, we all need reminders that hope and determination can light the way home. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey. Until next time, hold your loved ones close and never stop believing in the power of love to overcome any darkness.